What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today I wanted to provide a little bit of perk feedback for the Black Ops 7 beta, now that we've had a decent amount of time to really get a feel for things. And this video is primarily going to be focused on one perk in particular, and this is Dexterity, because I think there's an issue here somewhere that needs to be resolved for launch. I think there are various routes that could be taken when it comes to Dexterity to get it into a better place. But then after that conversation, I have a little bit of extra perk feedback that's much easier to list out, but we'll get to that toward the end of the video. Let's start it off with this Dexterity conversation. Now, Dexterity in the Black Ops 7 beta reduces your weapon motion and allows you to fully aim down sight on slides, dives, and wall jumps, and you also take less fall damage. Now, the key here, and the reason we're talking about this so much, is this is the only way to get fully aimed down sight when you're sliding or wall jumping. And without this perk, if you try to aim down sight while sliding and diving, you will automatically go into attack stance with a fairly wide spread instead of fully aiming down sight. So you're going to be a lot less accurate than somebody that's sliding and aiming with Dexterity. And I do understand the design intent when it comes to balancing Dexterity like this. It really seems they want to force a trade-off for those movement god type players, the ones that are sliding and jumping all over the place, primarily sliding all over the place into like pretty much every gunfight they get into. In theory, it seems reasonable that if that's the playstyle you want to go with, and you want to be as effective as possible with that playstyle, then you have to make a sacrifice and select this perk. Whereas for other players that aren't going to be sliding into every gunfight, for instance, they'll have the freedom to use a different perk that could help them in other areas that suit their playstyle. And in theory, that does make a fair amount of sense. However, I think the root of the issue here in practice is just how important sliding has become in Black Ops 6 and Black Ops 7 due to how they've balanced the slide and also due to Omni movement on top of that. Especially once you reach a certain level of play, sliding sort of just becomes the default method of getting around the map and challenging gunfights aggressively. And therefore, if you're somebody that really wants to improve at the game and you want to play optimally, sliding into gunfights doesn't really feel like a playstyle so much as just how you play the game effectively. It simply feels like a core part of the gameplay loop of the game based on how they've balanced the sliding. And so if you don't have Dexterity, it just makes the game feel bad. Again, even if you're not intending to go into the game as a movement god, you're still likely going to want to be implementing some sliding gunfights in your gameplay. And as a result, that makes Dexterity a complete crutch perk for so many players out there. And you might argue that that's too bad, like you don't need to use Dexterity, I don't need to use Dexterity, and I perform just fine. But at the end of the day, the people that are using Dexterity and sliding into fights, they're likely going to be dominating most of the players that aren't utilizing that playstyle because, like I said, this game really heavily pushes that slide into gunfights. It's a core part of the gameplay loop and typically the most effective method of challenging gunfights aggressively. So because of this, many players have been calling for them to just build Dexterity in, or at least that portion of Dexterity, build it into the game by default, like we had in Black Ops 6. You didn't need a perk to aim down sight and slide in Black Ops 6. You could just use Dexterity to become a little more accurate while doing that, but it wasn't a necessity. And honestly, I think that is one route they could take with Dexterity, is build that ability in by default, still make it so Dexterity makes you more accurate when performing those actions and aiming down sight, so make it so your sights aren't bobbing around as much with that movement. And then I just want to interject with an additional thing. If they're going to nerf it in that way, in order to make sure that it's still a very attractive choice, I would love to see faster mantle speeds attached to a perk, and I think it would fit really well with Dexterity if it weren't so powerful like it currently is. It's actually one of the gripes I have with this game, is it seems like so many actions can be performed so quickly until you need to mantle, and then that feels painfully slow, especially considering the fact that there's no way to improve that mantle speed as far as I've seen at least. So that is one potential solution, and I like the sounds of that solution. I'd be totally on board with that. However, it's not the only possible solution here. I think another thing they could do is simply improve your tactical stance spread when sliding and aiming or wall jumping and aiming without Dexterity, just to close that gap a little bit between somebody that has Dexterity and is sliding into fights versus somebody that doesn't have it and sliding into fights. Like, you'd still have the advantage with Dexterity, but the person in tac stance would have a bit more of a chance still to fight back effectively. That could honestly solve the issue there as well. That is something I've noticed, is without Dexterity, that tac stance spread just seems way too wide to effectively fight back, in many cases at least. Or another potential solution here that I think is more so targeting the root of the issue, and it could have some more positive impacts on the overall health of the game in general as well, even though some people won't like to hear this. Perhaps tone back the slide in general in the game. I'm not saying take it all the way to the point of like Modern Warfare 2022, where sliding into a fight was just a complete death sentence or anything, but maybe tone that back a little bit Make it so you don't get quite as much acceleration or total duration out of your slides. Take some of that power away so it no longer feels like it's the best thing to be doing 9 times out of 10 while simply moving around the map or challenging a gunfight aggressively. Still make it a very viable option and viable tool to be using for those things, but just dial it back to the point where it doesn't feel so bad if you aren't making sure that you're constantly implementing this into your gameplay just to be able to hold your own. If they did that, that would take a lot of the power away from the current state of dexterity. People would still use it, but it wouldn't feel as necessary to use this perk if it didn't feel as necessary to constantly be sliding. And the reason I personally like this solution, even as somebody that's adapted to the movement just fine, I slide around like crazy, I think this would also have positive impacts on the gameplay health in general, because I know the sliding in Black Ops 6 and now in the Black Ops 7 beta has turned a lot of players away from the game because it's simply too fast to keep up with. I know a lot of the higher skill players really enjoy it because there's a lot of skill expression there. And again, I'm not saying take all of that skill expression away or anything. I just think it's gotten to the point where it's too overwhelming for a lot of the more casual audience, and it has pushed them away from the game entirely. Also, a lot of people have been noticing the general pacing of Black Ops 7 in the beta, even though these maps are bigger and designed to give more room to breathe compared to Black Ops 6 maps, it can still often feel just way too chaotic. Like there's just so much happening so quickly, it's hard to keep track of what's going on around you. And I think a big part of that is due to how powerful the slide is. So toning that back in general, while still keeping it viable, I think would help dial that pacing back to a more reasonable level that would still be fast-paced, just less chaotically paced. And I think it would just bring some better balance between the more casual audience that doesn't want everything to be happening at 100 miles an hour and they just can't keep up with it, while still allowing for skill expression from the players that do like a lot of movement. Honestly, out of these solutions I've mentioned here, this is the one that I think would have the biggest overall positive impact on the game, while also addressing the fact that Dexterity is such a crutch perk at the moment for so many players out there. But those are my thoughts on the Dexterity situation. I do think something needs to change here, and perhaps there are other solutions as well, but those are the ones that really came to mind for me. Next, let's talk about some other perk feedback that I don't need to go into nearly as much depth with. Keeping in mind, Treyarch has confirmed that they are planning on making some more perk adjustments between beta and launch, so we already know they're going to be tweaking some things at least. But the first thing is, I do feel both the Cold-Blooded perk and the Shadow perk are very out of place in the Tier 1 slot. The Tier 1 slot is all about like playstyle defining perks, in my eyes at least. That's how I see it. These are the really powerful perks where there are some key trade-offs to be made here. And I like having these trade-offs as well. Like there are certain perks I don't think you should be able to combine unless you use the Perk Greed wildcard, for instance, like Ghost and Flak Jacket. I think that's a totally fair balance where it's you can stay off the minimap or you can have explosive resistance, but you can't have both unless you're using a wildcard to do that. I think that's great. The problem here is Cold-Blooded just doesn't really seem to fit because it is so situational. It can be a helpful perk, but generally only when the enemy team has streaks up in the air. So why would you spend your most powerful and useful perk slot on something that may come into play at some point later in the match, when you could be using something that's going to be helping you constantly with your playstyle? Additionally, I think you should always have the ability to go full stealth, so Ghost, Ninja, and Cold-Blooded. It's fine if you have to use a wildcard to do that, but even with a wildcard in this state, you can't do that because they're all in the same tier. So I do think Cold-Blooded does belong somewhere else, not in Tier 1. And it's the same story with Shadow. I just feel this perk is too situational to be including in that first tier. Because relative to Flak Jacket, for instance, that's helping you constantly because it helps with any explosion that's going on around you, and there tends to be a lot of explosions around the map. Whereas with Shadow, this is only helping you against things that you would trigger. And therefore, it depends very heavily on what the enemy players are using and how effectively they're even using those things. And in a lot of cases, all you would need is Flak Jacket anyway to protect you from that thing. Sure, it's not quite the same as not triggering that thing at all, because then you're not alerting that enemy to your presence. But again, that's just such a situational thing. And as a result, I just don't think Shadow belongs as a Tier 1 perk. Then, just in general, I feel like many of the other perks in the game almost feel like half perks. Like they would work really well for the Ghost perk system, where they can assign a different cost to different perks based on how powerful they are. So some perks would cost 3 points on your class, whereas others would only cost 1. But the problem with the tiered system is there isn't a weighting to that. And I see several situations where within the same tier, I'm seeing what would be a 1-point perk up against 2 and 3-point perks. So it's not necessarily that these perks are certain perks are like terrible and totally useless. It's just relative to the other perks in that tier, I don't see why anybody would ever use them. So just one of several examples here is like the close shave perk, for instance. In tier 2, this basically gives you the ability to have a one-hit melee with the butt of your gun, rather than having you to switch to a melee weapon to get a one-hit, or just deal with the fact that it's a two-hit melee. That's definitely a nice to have perk that will help you in some very specific situations where you happen to be right up close and personal against an enemy, but realistically, that is going to be a very situational perk. And when you put that up against something like fast hands, for instance, where every single time you reload, that's helping you reload faster. And every time you swap weapons, you're swapping weapons faster. There's just so much more power throughout a match to fast hands compared to something like close shave, which may help you like once or twice throughout a match, or you may not get into any situations at all where you end up using it. That's just one example, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that I feel like there are some clear perk imbalances within the tiers themselves. And some of the perks in this game feel like they're half perks, like they could be combined with another perk to create a more viable option to choose from. Now finally, I do have a few specific things I wanted to mention based on some of the testing I've done with some of these perks. The first one is lightweight. For those of you guys that missed my movement video, it turns out lightweight only appears to be helping with your sprint speed. No other movement speeds, even though the perk description says that it helps with your movement speed, that movement speed is only your sprint speed. It doesn't help with your walking speed. It doesn't help with your aim down sight movement speed. It only helps with sprinting. And as a tier 1 perk, again, that's the most powerful tier of perks, I think this should be helping your movement speed across the board, not just with sprinting. Next, with Ghost, I think Ghost is actually working properly just based on how enemy players are reacting, but I've noticed on your end, when you look at your minimap, your arrow doesn't seem to be fading away when moving and therefore activating the Ghost perk like we would normally expect to see with this style of Ghost perk. So then you can see when your Ghost is active versus when it's not active. So that's more so likely just a bug fix or something along those lines, like maybe it's just in an unfinished state and it needs to get polished up for launch. And another thing I wanted to mention is Looper seems to be working inconsistently. I've had situations while using Looper where I've earned all of my streaks and I have no ability to earn them again within the same life. And I don't know if I'm misunderstanding something, but it says DEP on the streak. And even when earning all of the score that should be required to earn that streak again, nothing happens there. So something seems to be broken with Looper as far as I can tell. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the perk feedback that I've got here today. Now, I'm very curious to see what they end up changing. Like I said, they are planning on making some changes here, and this is where I want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. First off, on the topic of dexterity, do you think something needs to be done here? And if so, what's the solution that you like the best? Is it something I mentioned today, or perhaps you have a different solution that could work for that? And then outside of that, do you have any other bits of perk feedback to provide for Black Ops 7? Are there things that you'd like to see adjusted or like perks you'd like to see moved from one tier to another? Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.